Howdy, folks, and welcome to Saddle and Sixskin, your home for stories from the Old West. Now, before we get started, I'd be mighty grateful if you'd hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us keep these stories coming. We know our viewers are an older crowd, folks from 30 to 75 years old, some even over 40 years of age, so we'll keep the pace leisurely, and the stories true to the spirit of the West. Now, let's settle in and hear a tale of courage, resilience, and love born in the rugged Colorado territory. Are you ready? The rifle cracked through the mountain air like a bolt of thunder, a sound that echoed through the pines and startled the birds from their nests. Elizabeth Cooper, her heart pounding like a runaway stagecoach, watched the bandit crumple to the dusty ground, his dirty hands still clawing at the knife strapped to his worn leather belt. Scott Young, his weathered face etched with concern, slowly lowered his Winchester, the metallic scent of gunpowder hanging heavy in the crisp, thin air. A crimson trickle seeped from a shallow gash that marred Elizabeth's left cheek, a cruel reminder of where the man's sharp blade had kissed her skin only moments before. He intended to disfigure her? What was that all about? But, despite the bloody wound and the dust staining her torn dress, her blue eyes held no trace of fear now, only a steely, determined glint. She stood tall and proud, a small defiant figure against the backdrop of the majestic mountains. How did she muster that? Despite the bruises that bloomed across her arms like wildflowers, despite the tattered state of her clothing and the desperate circumstances that had led her to this windswept ridge in the Colorado territory, she was not broken. The man who had bought her, for what amounted to the price of a good horse, now stood between her and a death that seemed almost certain just moments before. In that instant, a profound understanding dawned within her, a realization of what it truly meant to be protected, not just physically, but with an unwavering commitment to her safety and well-being. Isn't that what we all want? To feel protected? Now, if you're enjoying this story, please give Saddle and Sixskin a thumbs up. We have many other tales just like this about the Old West, pioneers, outlaws, and everything in between. 3 months earlier, Elizabeth had stood in the cramped, one-room cabin that served as her family's meager home, the scent of wood smoke and desperation clinging to the air. Her father, James Adams, a man worn down by hardship, counted out the few coins in his calloused palm, the silver glinting weakly in the dim light. The harsh winter had been particularly cruel, slowly claiming their livestock, one by one, until only a skeletal few remained. Now, with the arrival of spring, there was no relief, no sense of renewal, only the gnawing emptiness of bellies and the persistent, haunting specter of starvation. Her mother, a woman who had once possessed a vibrant spirit, lay pale and gaunt in the corner bed, her frail body consumed by a relentless coughing sickness that had plagued her throughout the long, unforgiving winter. Her younger siblings, their faces gaunt and their eyes wide with worry, huddled together on a threadbare blanket, seeking warmth and comfort from one another, despite the weak May sunshine streaming through the cracked window panes. James Adams, once a man of unwavering pride and unyielding strength, now moved through their failing homestead like a restless ghost, his shoulders slumped with the weight of his impossible burden. How much can one person bear? How much? His shoulders bowed under the crushing weight of choices no man should ever have to face, choices that threatened to tear his family apart. Elizabeth had watched him age before her very eyes, each passing day etching deeper lines of worry and despair into his weathered face. She had seen the light fade from his eyes as he came to the devastating realization that he was utterly powerless to provide for his family's basic needs. The relentless drought had ravaged their crops, leaving fields barren and lifeless. The harsh winter had decimated their livestock, leaving them with barely enough to survive. Now, like vultures circling a dying carcass, creditors gathered at their doorstep, demanding payment for debts that seemed to multiply in the encroaching darkness. He was a broken man, stripped of his pride and dignity by circumstances beyond his control. What was he to do? When the stranger arrived that fateful morning, leading a magnificent bay mare, her coat gleaming like polished mahogany, behind his own sturdy mount, James Adams stepped outside, clutching at a desperate hope, like a drowning man reaching for a piece of driftwood. The mountain man was a formidable figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that brushed against his collar and eyes the color of a stormy winter sky. His clothes, though well-made, were practical and functional, designed for the rigors of mountain life. He carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man accustomed to solitude, hardship, and the unwavering respect of the wild. Scott Young, for that was his name, had heard about the Adams family's troubles in town. Before we continue with the story, I'd like to remind you to subscribe to Saddle and Sixskin. It's absolutely free, and it will help the channel grow so we can bring you even more Western tales. We love to read the comments, so feel free to leave your comments, positive or negative, to help us make our videos better. Let's return to the story. Word spread quickly in those small, isolated communities, especially when it involved a family teetering on the brink of ruin. He had also heard whispers about the daughter, Elizabeth. Just 19 years old and unmarried, she was a rare beauty, her spirit shining brightly despite the crushing poverty that marked her family. What a terrible situation. He needed a wife, someone to share the burdens of his isolated life high in the mountains, someone to help him build a lasting legacy in the unforgiving wilderness. The proposition he put forth was simple, brutally practical, and born of desperation on both sides. Elizabeth pressed her ear against the thin cabin wall, her heart pounding in her chest as she listened to her father negotiate away her future for the paltry price of survival. Had he no shame? The horse, that magnificent bay mare, was worth more than their entire homestead, more than every possession they owned combined. It would provide transportation, a means to travel to town for supplies and trade. It could be bred for future income, offering a glimmer of hope in a situation that seemed utterly hopeless. More than that, it represented a new beginning, a chance to escape the cycle of poverty and hardship that had plagued their family for so long. Her father's voice cracked as he spoke, each word laced with a pain that pierced her very soul. She could hear the tears he desperately tried to conceal from the stranger, the shame and regret that weighed heavily on his heart. He loved his daughter, and the thought of selling her future for short-term gain tore him apart inside. The arrangement was settled with a handshake and the exchange of a few meager personal belongings. Elizabeth would go with Scott Young to his remote mountain cabin, becoming his wife in name and deed. In return, her family would receive the mare and enough supplies to see them through the coming winter months, a lifeline that would keep them from starvation. Would Elizabeth take his hand? It was a transaction as old as civilization itself, a harsh reality dressed up in the stark necessities of frontier life. The first night in Scott's cabin, perched high in the mountains where the air was thin and the silence was absolute, Elizabeth sat on the edge of the narrow bed and wept. She wept not only for her lost innocence, though that too had been surrendered with quiet resignation, but also for the life she had always imagined for herself. She was so very young. She had dreamed of love, of a marriage born from affection and mutual respect, not from economic necessity. She had dreamed of choosing her own path, of pursuing her own desires and ambitions. Instead, she found herself bound to a stranger in a place so remote that her screams would echo only among the distant peaks. Scott, to his credit, had been gentle, perhaps understanding her fear and apprehension, or perhaps simply uncomfortable with the entire arrangement himself. Now, halfway through our story, I wanted to encourage you to subscribe to Saddle and Sixskin. The more subscribers we get, the more people we can bring back memories of the Old West to. Please, don't hesitate. It's free to subscribe, just push that button. He had given her space when she needed it, respecting her boundaries and allowing her to process her emotions in her own way. He had spoken softly when he spoke at all, choosing his words carefully, avoiding anything that might cause her further distress. He treated her with a quiet courtesy that both surprised and bewildered her, a stark contrast to the harshness of their circumstances. But gentleness alone could not erase the fundamental truth of their situation. She was now property, bought and paid for, expected to fulfill her role as wife and helpmate to a man she did not know or love. The mountain cabin, though larger and more comfortable than her family's cramped home, felt like a prison, its walls closing in on her, suffocating her hopes and dreams. The structure was built of solid logs and chinked against the biting winter winds. It sat in a small clearing, surrounded by towering pines that seemed to stretch endlessly towards the sky, with a panoramic view of distant peaks that would have been breathtaking under different circumstances. Scott had clearly spent years preparing this place, building a life for himself in the wilderness. With a well-stocked root cellar filled with provisions, a sturdy barn for the animals, and fields cleared for planting, it was the home of a man who planned for the future, who understood the rhythms of mountain life, and who valued self-sufficiency above all else. Elizabeth threw herself into the work of her new life with grim determination. What else could she do? She cooked and cleaned, tending the small garden with meticulous care, and helped with the animals Scott kept. There were chickens and goats, a milk cow to provide sustenance, and the magnificent bay mare that had been her bride price, now heavy with foal, carrying new life within her womb. The work was hard, physically demanding, but familiar, and it gave her something to focus on, something to distract her from the strangeness of her situation and the ache in her heart. How did she manage? Scott proved to be a man of few words, preferring action to empty conversation. But his actions spoke volumes. He could track game through terrain that seemed utterly impossible to navigate, his keen eyes spotting the faintest sign, the smallest disturbance in the undergrowth. He could read the weather patterns in the behavior of birds and the color of clouds, anticipating storms long before they arrived. He possessed an intimate, almost mystical knowledge of the mountain wilderness that surrounded them, a knowledge that had been passed down through generations. He treated Elizabeth with consistent respect, never raising his voice or his hand to her, but maintaining a distance that felt both protective and isolating. It was as if he was unsure how to navigate their unconventional marriage, hesitant to intrude upon her grief or expectations. Weeks passed in this careful dance of coexistence, each of them cautiously circling the other, unsure how to bridge the gap between them. Elizabeth began to understand the rhythms of Scott's life, the way he rose before dawn to check his trap lines, the methodical way he maintained his equipment, the quiet satisfaction he took in providing for their small household. He did these things meticulously. She also began to notice the way he constantly watched the horizon, the subtle tension that never quite left his shoulders, and the loaded rifle that was never far from his reach. The mountains were not as empty as they seemed. There were other men in the wilderness, some honest trappers and prospectors seeking a new life, but others of a far darker nature. Bandits and claim jumpers moved through the high country, preying on isolated homesteads and travelers, taking what they could by force and leaving destruction in their wake. Scott had chosen his location carefully, selecting a place that was difficult to reach and easy to defend. But no place was completely safe from determined men with bad intentions. Elizabeth's first real understanding of the dangers they faced came on a morning in late summer when Scott returned from checking his traps with blood staining his shirt and a grim expression etched on his face. What could it be this time? He had found signs of strangers in the area, men who were not there for any legitimate purpose. The tracks suggested at least 3 riders, moving carefully and deliberately, avoiding the main trails, and taking pains to conceal their presence. They had been watching the cabin, studying its approaches and defenses, assessing its vulnerabilities. That night, Scott sat Elizabeth down by the crackling fire and explained their situation with the same quiet directness he brought to everything else. There were men in these mountains who would not hesitate to kill him, to take everything he had built, including her. The isolation that provided privacy and independence also meant that help was days away, assuming anyone even knew they were in trouble. Their survival depended on vigilance, meticulous preparation, and the unwavering willingness to fight when fighting became necessary. Elizabeth felt a knot of fear settle in her stomach like a cold stone, a chilling premonition of what was to come. But alongside it came something unexpected, something surprising. For the first time since arriving at the cabin, she felt truly needed, not just as a cook or a housekeeper, but as a vital partner in their survival. This was not just about performing chores or fulfilling obligations. This was about protecting something that mattered, about defending their home, their way of life, and each other. She asked Scott to teach her to shoot, to show her how to read the telltale signs that warned of danger, to make her a full partner in their defense rather than simply another thing to be protected. She wanted to learn how to defend herself. Scott's initial surprise at her request was evident, but he agreed without argument, recognizing the strength and determination that burned within her. Over the following days, he patiently taught her to handle the spare rifle, to load and fire it quickly and accurately, to compensate for the kick and maintain her composure under pressure. He showed her the best positions around the cabin for defense, the routes they could use to escape if necessary, and the silent signals they would use to communicate without words. He was a skilled instructor, methodical and patient. Elizabeth proved to be a quick and eager learner, her fear transforming into a determined competence. She practiced diligently, honing her skills until she could hit a target at considerable distance with unwavering accuracy. The lessons brought them closer together than months of shared domestic routine had managed, forging a bond of trust and mutual respect. Working side by side, planning their defense, trusting each other with their lives, they began to develop the kind of partnership that Elizabeth had never imagined possible in their arranged marriage. They were growing closer. She saw past Scott's stoic exterior to the man beneath, a man who had chosen solitude not from misanthropy or bitterness, but from a deep and abiding need for peace, independence, and self-determination. He was a man of principle, a man who valued honesty and integrity above all else. He, in turn, began to see her not as the frightened girl who had arrived at his cabin, but as a woman of remarkable strength and courage, capable of facing adversity with unwavering resolve when circumstances demanded it. The transformation was slow and subtle, but it was undeniable. What would happen? Now, before we finish the story, let me encourage you to subscribe to Saddle and Sixskin. And if you liked this story, give me a thumbs up. The attack came 3 weeks later, just before dawn on a morning when the first frost had painted the meadow grass silver. Elizabeth woke to Scott's hand gently shaking her shoulder, his finger pressed to his lips in a silent gesture for quiet. Through the cabin window, she could see dark shapes moving in the tree line, shadowy figures positioned to surround their home. She knew what was about to happen. Scott's careful preparations proved their worth as they silently took their positions, like seasoned soldiers preparing for battle. Elizabeth stood watch at the back window with the spare rifle, her heart pounding but her hands steady. Scott covered the front approach, his Winchester resting comfortably in his arms, his eyes scanning the darkness with unwavering intensity. The bandits, emboldened by their past successes, had expected to find a lone mountain man and perhaps a helpless woman, easy prey for their greed and lust. Instead, they faced coordinated resistance from two people who knew their ground and were prepared to fight for it. Scott had not underestimated the enemy. The battle was brief but intense, the echoes of gunfire reverberating off the mountain walls like thunder, shattering the morning stillness. Elizabeth's first shot, aimed with deadly precision, took down a man who was trying to circle behind the cabin, her rigorous training overcoming her initial terror as she saw him crumple to the ground. Scott's deadly accuracy with his Winchester eliminated the leader before he could organize a proper assault. They took the lead to eliminate the leaders. When the smoke cleared and the echoes faded, two bandits lay dead in the clearing, their dreams of easy riches buried with them. The third had fled on foot, abandoning his horse in his desperate haste to escape the hail of gunfire. Elizabeth found herself shaking, not with fear, but with a fierce and unfamiliar sense of pride. She had defended her home. She had stood beside her husband as an equal partner in their survival. She had faced down the enemy and emerged victorious. The girl who had been sold for the price of a horse was gone, replaced by a woman who had proven her worth in the most fundamental way possible. In the aftermath of the battle, as they tended to Scott's minor wounds and secured their home against further threats, Elizabeth realized that something fundamental had irrevocably changed between them. The careful distance they had maintained was gone, replaced by the intimacy born of shared danger and mutual dependence. What would it lead to? When Scott looked at her now, she saw not just duty or obligation in his eyes, but a genuine respect and the glimmer of something deeper, something that hinted at a love that was beginning to blossom in the fertile soil of their shared adversity. This bond was a deep respect and love that was born out of the struggle of those that tried to overpower them. The transaction that took place between the two families meant nothing. Well, that's the story for today, folks. I hope you enjoyed that tale of the Old West. Don't forget to like and subscribe to Saddle and Sixskin for more great content. And if you have a particular story you'd like to hear, leave us a comment below. We appreciate your support and look forward to seeing you next time.